Chapter 7 We Never Had a Prom. We first had to change appearances for appearances mattered. The alteration of the football uniform, the forced equality of black and white student body presidents, all the window dressing somebody, not students, came up with to try to symbolize racial equality and change, where for the sake of appearances and harmless overall. The old traditions we all knew, black and white, had to evolve, give way to new influences, include other traditions never before considered, or die. Most of all, we had to find a way to get past the prejudice and preconceptions that all of us, black and white, brought new relationships we'd never thought before and hadn't a clue how to develop. Unique school identities and cultures manifest themselves not so much in the formal classroom and curriculum, those tend to be fairly universal and uniform regardless of where the school is located, but in the school's extracurricular activities, homecoming traditions, the annual beauty pageant, senior class portraits, pep rallies, choir concerts, the senior play, the battle of the classes, class favorites, and the junior senior prom, senior skip day, etc., just to name a few. School colors, mascots, alma mater, sports traditions, and even the name of the yearbook or annual are often passed down from generation to generation. For many students, their personal identities, their social relationships, and the leisure time are defined by the extracurricular activities at their school. It is no wonder then that when school desegregation occurred, many students rightly asked about what about football, cheerleading, band, the beta club, and prom. For years, segregationists had warned about the dire consequences of race mixing. The Citizens Council built its campaign to preserve segregated public schools around predictions that integration of schools would bring about interracial friendship, dating, and marriage, thus the end of racial integrity, and the dominance of the white race. And the murders of Emmett Till in 1955 and Mac Charles Parker in 1959 were all too recent reminders to blacks of the deadly consequences of any allegations, whether factual or not, of trying to mix socially with whites. Thus, as schools began to desegregate in the late 1960s, at the forefront of everyone's mind was the issue of social integration among black and white students. Should interracial friendships be encouraged? What would be acceptable socializing outside the classroom? Should black and white students be forced to sit together in the cafeteria or play with each other at recess? When was physical contact across race appropriate? When was intermingling definitely off limits? These questions would be worked out in part in the extracurricular spaces of schools, where race, adolescent identity, and youth culture collided and coalesced in ways that both transformed and reproduced race relations in the South. Extracurricular activities were first introduced into urban secondary schools in the early 20th century for the purpose of assimilating thousands of poor and immigrant students into white middle class Protestant values and norms. Educational reformers of the day believed that participation in sports, student organizations, and school sponsored social activities would inculcate youth into virtues of cooperation, teamwork, persistence, and loyalty, which would in turn translate into skills needed to be patriotic, hardworking, productive adult citizens of the nation state. By the 1950s, sports, band, cheerleading, honor societies, junior, senior banquets, dances, award ceremonies, and other extracurricular activities were solid fixtures of American high schools and helped define the unique culture of the American teenager. Whether one was black or white or attended Brinkley High in Jackson or Hancock High on the Gulf Coast, being in the band, singing in the choir, serving as student body president, or playing football defined for many young people who they were and how others perceived them. Harold Bishop was a football player in the late 1950s in Corinth at Eastman High, a segregated all-black school with a rich history of sports and extracurricular activities. Every Friday during football season, the cheerleaders led the high-energy pep rallies, with cheers inspired with the music heard out at Memphis and Nashville on the WDIA and the WCLA, and the call response worship in their Baptist churches. It was a community bonding event where students, staff, and community members rallied around their Eastman High Yellow Jackets. Harold recalls one of his favorite cheers. Leader, is Tupelo going to win? Fans, yeah, man. Leader, is Tupelo going to win? Yeah, man. Oh, you stop that lie. You know it's a sin. You know doggone well. Corinth is going to win. Jill Covington Grubbs, a cheerleader at the all-white Murray High in Jackson in 1967, has similar recollections of the electrifying atmosphere of their pep rallies and the crowd support from the Mighty Mustangs. I will never, ever forget the first time to run into the gym for my first Mustang pep rally. Didn't even realize that even the teachers and janitorial staff came to watch and participate. My hair stood up on my arms, and I remembered looking up into the bleachers at my classmates and seeing all of them chanting. When the football captain of the week got the microphone, the crowd would go wild. The importance of the extracurricular was not lost on those involved in enforcing desegregation in the South. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act specifically mentioned that racial discrimination in any aspect of schooling was prohibited, including school-sponsored projects outside the classrooms. In a June 1966 brochure, the United States Commission of Civil Rights wrote, "Law says that there can be no discrimination in school facilities, services, and activities. This includes sports, participation, social and educational activities, drinking, fountains, washrooms, lunchrooms, classroom seating, auditoriums, locker rooms, use of materials, buses, etc. Also, Negro parents may attend PTA meetings, commencement exercises, and all other school events. However, the federal government did not offer any specific guidance on how to deal with the election of school officers, membership in the school band, the selection of class favorites, or any other facet of school life outside for the formal curriculum. Perhaps they thought these details too trite for the legislative or administrative oversight. Instead, superintendents, school boards, and principals decided the fate of the extracurricular activities in their newly desegregated schools, whether it was concern over safety, the possibility of students interacting in ways deemed inappropriate by adults, or they were just too busy with curricular issues. Many school administrators initially chose to eliminate or greatly curtail all or most extracurricular activities in their schools during the early days of school desegregation. Thomas and Carolyn Evans were two of seven black students to attend Madison Ridgeland High School in 1968 under FOC. Both accomplished musicians, they had been actively involved in the band and their segregated school, Rosa Scott. However, when they tried to join the band at their new school, they were repeatedly refused. Their mother, determined that their children would have access to the same opportunities as white children at Madison Ridgeland, filed a grievance with the school district. Thomas describes their reception once the band program was ordered to include them. By the end of the first semester, Mama decided to take action. We took the matter to court, and the school was forced to allow us in the band during the second semester. The school was charged with violating the Civil Rights Act, but by that time it was concert season, and we were allowed to practice with the band only. As well as I knew that I could play that horn, I had to play last trumpet and Carolyn last clarinet. When it came time for the band to perform, they either failed to inform us or gave some excuse why we couldn't go. One excuse was the concert band performed at private functions that didn't allow blacks. When Thomas and Carolyn returned to Madison Ridgeland after the summer break, they discovered that their new high school no longer offered a band program. Thomas was stunned. Now I've heard of many things and had come to expect certain ducks and dodges when it came to equal opportunities, but this took the cake. What kind of administration or school system would go to the extreme of abolishing the entire band program just to keep two black students out? When the Jackson School District went through desegregation, some of the formerly black high schools were converted to 10th grade attendance centers. Brinkley High was one of those. Brinkley had a rich tradition of sports and extracurricular activities. In 68 to 69, it won the state basketball championship. But when the school reopened in 70, under court-ordered desegregation, all extracurricular activities were suspended per order from the school board. Such draconian measures also extended into rural school districts. When the schools in Kemper County were desegregated in January 1970, the school board just suspended the rest of the basketball season. Coach Billy Brown, the only white coach who remained in the public schools after desegregation, continued to hold spring football practice, not knowing the future of his football program. When school began in August 1970, virtually every white student had left the public schools, and the school board canceled the first 8 football games of the season. Other schools took a more modified approach in the curtailing their extracurricular offerings. For example, Yazoo City and Natchez retained the sports program and the band, but canceled pep rallies, homecoming activities, school assemblies, and all social activities. Students were typically not consulted about any decisions regarding school desegregation, curricular or extracurricular, but students often led the charge to reinstate extracurricular activities. At Greenwood High School, the principal threatened to eliminate homecoming the first semester of desegregation. This infuriated many of the students, including the editor of the newspaper and a GHS cheerleader who was charged into the principal's office, swooped past the secretary, and according to classmate Mary Carol Miller, told the principal in no uncertain terms, "By God, you're not canceling homecoming. You've taken everything away from us. You're not taking that away from us. You can say we're not going to have it, but we're going to have it. So it can be sanctioned or not." Greenwood High had homecoming that year, but eliminated the annual school-sponsored homecoming dance. When schools began reconfiguring their extracurricular offerings, black parents became very ever vigilant, carefully monitoring the activities of their children to make sure that they were included in all facets of school life. When instances of discrimination in the classroom or in extracurricular activities were discovered, many black parents lodged complaints with their local school boards. If not remedied, they filed lawsuits. During the first year of desegregation in Rankin County, the school eliminated several extracurricular activities and social events. It also set 1:30 p.m. as the new dismissal time. The justification was the needs of many students who worked after school or had chores at home to complete. For black parents like Aline and John Adams, this signaled a significant deviation from normal school activities that could only be attributed to the school's district's desire to limit the amount of contact white students had with their black peers both in and out of the classroom. On behalf of their son, who attended Rankin High, the Adams filed a lawsuit against the Rankin Board of Education for persistent discrimination. Their grievances included discrimination in staffing and curriculum and in extracurricular activities. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in the favor of Adams and the other plaintiffs and specifically addressed the issue of extracurricular activities. There have been several allegations that the closing time of the school has been changed to an earlier hour in the day and that certain social events have been discontinued in order to avoid some of the sociological implications of a unitary school system. Of course, we all know that these actions were inescapably products of the Rankin County recalcitrance in hopes to diminish local sociological reactions. None seem justified now. On the remand, the court shall make a thorough factual reassessment of the current state of affairs in Rankin County and take all steps necessary to eliminate all vestiges of a dual system, including both curricular and extracurricular activities, social, athletic, musical, and other groups. The wholesale elimination of extracurricular activities did not last long, due in part to the vocal protest of students, but extracurricular activities were also important to many adults in the community whose social lives were built around their children's activities. They volunteered in the concession stand, collected tickets at football games, held bake sales to raise money for new cheerleading uniforms, and participated in the Booster Club. In many small towns, Friday Night Football, with all its pageantry, was the most highly anticipated and attended social event of the week. Even community members who no longer had children in the schools often identified greatly with the accomplishments of their high school football team, their band, or their show choir. Thus, when the school desegregation was finally enforced, many adults were at a forefront fighting for the preservation of extracurricular activities in their schools. The transition to school desegregation brought intense scrutiny of school policies and practices from both the HEW and concerned parents. As more than one principal commented, I always felt like someone was looking over my shoulder. To assuage concerns from multiple parties about inclusion and access to extracurricular activities, school administrators often adopted new policies aimed at securing fair and equal representation of black and white students on homecoming court in student leadership positions and membership in school organizations. According to George Dale, a principal at Moss Point High, the problem of school integration was not an issue of academics, it was an issue of extracurricular. His most challenging task as a new principal in Moss Point was to ensure black students, who were numerically a minority after schools were desegregated, were represented in extracurricular activities. He explains a kid in the back of the school, a kid at the black school, might have been president of the student body, head cheerleader, whatever, but when they merged the schools together, because they were approximately 70% white population in the merged situation, the white kids pretty well assumed that it was their school. And you're coming in, you're like an outsider coming in. You're not the president of the student body anymore. Charles George, a black assistant principal at West Tallahatchie in the first year of desegregation, noted that even in desegregated schools in which the black to white ratio was more balanced or black students were the majority, it left the student or teacher selection. White students continued to retain positions of leadership. When integration came, the same lady, a white student, remained president and she worked as hard as she could to get them integrated, but the whites kind of dominated the extracurricular. The fact is that they've been accustomed to being organized. They had the Lions Club, the Rotary Club, the Boy Scouts building, and dens, Cub Scout mothers, and that sort of thing. George Dale implemented a fairly common policy adopted during that time. We had co-student body president, co-class president, we had co-everything. Charles Boone, principal at Quitman High, implemented a similar policy, co-officers for all clubs and organizations. Dale, Boone, and other principals adopting such measures felt that no one could question the fairness of electing both a black and a white student for positions of leadership. However, such policies were not necessarily popular with either students or parents. Discussions about merit and qualifications sometimes led to accusations of reverse discrimination or favoritism. Why should someone be elected to a position solely on her race when the other more qualified students were denied? Many asked. Principal Charles Boone' response was a pragmatic one. Equal representation meant the same number of blacks and whites in every facet of extracurricular activities. He explained, I had to do something, and I did not want anyone to be left completely out, regardless whether they were qualified. In other words, you may have some instances where blacks had 4 people better than any of the whites, but I'm still going to get a white in and vice versa. I made sure both races were there, still going to get a white in and vice versa. Made sure both races were there. I reread that twice. Such policies were often extended to the selection of class favorites in the homecoming court. For example, students would elect both a black and white student for the friendliest and most likely to succeed, or a black Mr. and Miss Greenville and a white Mr. and Mrs. Greenville. Alan Huffman described the selection process for class beauties at Murrah High during his senior year. We had been required to vote for both black and white class beauties and favorites, in equal number, which had been an eye opener, if only because it revealed to us that black and white students often had different ideas about who was beautiful and favored. At Jim Hill High School in Jackson, equal representation in class favorites was handled in a slightly different way. Ricky Nations, a student at Jim Hill High School in Jackson, explained if a black male got Mr. Jim Hill, he had the most votes. Then the white female with the most votes would be Miss Jim Hill. At Quitman High, Charles Boone made an alteration in how the homecoming queen and her court, often called maids, were chosen after his school was desegregated. I always had the football team choose the homecoming court by secret ballot. Well, what I did, I told them, we'll have a queen and maid of honor, and whoever gets the most votes will be the queen, and the next lady of the opposite race will be the maid of honor, and we will recognize both of them. One could certainly argue that without these interventionist policies, black students would have been excluded from many facets of high school life because it was usually black students who were transferred to the white school, where whites assumed they would retain positions of power of class president, head cheerleader, and Mr. Gulfport High. However, in some school districts, these policies were adopted for a quite different reason: to keep white students in the public schools by assuring them that even if they were numerically a minority in the new school, they would come to continue to be selected for prestigious awards and highly sought after positions. If left to their personal sense of fairness, sometimes students surprised themselves and their teachers. In the first year of desegregation at Murrah High, the top award was not determined by equal representation dictum. Instead, it was decided by popular vote. The student body elected a black boy and a white girl for this highest award. For hundreds of years, blacks and whites in the South were prohibited from any social interaction through laws, social mores, and well understood and strictly enforced codes of racial etiquette. Prior to school desegregation, it would be rare indeed to have seen black and white young people standing, chatting, and laughing together in any kind of social activity. Yet, with the integration of class favorites and class officers, black boys and white girls standing side by side or posing playfully together were captured in photographs that appeared in newspapers and yearbooks throughout the state. Ricky Nations recalls the reactions of some of his white friends to a picture in his yearbook of the biracial couple selected as Mr. and Mrs. Jim Hill High. You didn't see a whole lot of formal pictures with a black guy and a white girl, and we had it in our annual. A lot of my friends from other white schools couldn't believe that there was a white guy and a black girl, or vice versa, that it had been done that way purposefully. Similarly, Alan Huffman recalls how the photograph of Murrah High's Blue Knight and Silver Lady was disconcerting to many, for it captured an attractive young black man and white woman who looked like a couple ready for an elegant dinner followed by a night of dancing. Seeing them posed together in the resume like some interracial couple in formal attire at a 1973 prom in Jackson, Mississippi was mildly provocative to some of our parents. Alan and Ricky's comment about the visual image of black and white boys and girls together allude to the symbolic significance of the extracurricular. The smiling faces of a black boy and a white girl dressed in formal suits and evening gowns posed on a spiraling staircase in the local church or home, shoulders almost touching, was an image heretofore unseen in the South. It was tangible evidence to the dismay of some and hope for many that social integration was a byproduct of school desegregation and that times were indeed changing. In chronicling school desegregation in his hometown in Yazoo City, Willie Morris, the editor of Harper's Magazine, expressed great faith that the younger generation would be the catalyst for social change, though their discovery, by going to school together, of the commonalities they shared based on their sense of place, Morris wrote. They are the first white and black children in America brought together under the court specific doctrine of mass integration, and they are intensely curious about each other. They fumble for words to express their new feelings. They are as American as they are Southern. But it is the common bond in the South, the rhythms and tempos, the ways of speaking, remembering the place and the land the people knew and out of which they suffered together. That makes them young blacks and whites more alike than dissimilar. And it is this, before it is all over, that there will be their salvation. Principal William Dodson expressed a similar observation about his black and white students at Greenville High. There's some mystique about a young kid that they will get together despite that their parents are telling them. Implicit in both comments is the belief that somehow students during desegregation, if felt of their own impulses and intuitions, would navigate race relations much better than their parents, even if doing so required them to defy the teachings of their parents, their church, and other adult institutions in their lives. Some students certainly rose to the challenge. Archie Johnson was a junior when his hometown of Columbia was ordered to desegregate in January 1970. He was apprehensive about leaving Jefferson High for a number of reasons, the prime one being uncertainty of how his student life he so loved at Jefferson High would continue at the integrated Columbia High. Archie explains, "We had excellent teachers and a decent facility. The beauty of our system was that we could be in everything, play football, continue in band, especially in concert band. We were in choir, we were in theater, I was in every yearly play that we had, and for the most part it was great, I enjoyed it." As part of Mississippi's delaying tactics, they had done a lot of renovation. We had a state of the art gymnasium and auditorium that was built maybe a couple 3 years before integration. So we had a top notch facility there. We were just getting settled into that and getting comfortable. Jefferson was all that we knew, so there was some resentment, some pain in terms of having to leave this history and all. Everything changed. A student assembly had been planned for the first day where the students at Jefferson High would be joining students at Columbia High. The junior class presidents of both schools were to meet a podium and each deliver an address. Archie was the president at Jefferson High and had been working for weeks with his social studies teacher preparing a speech. When it was time for him to speak, he walked up to the podium and gave the student body the peace sign. They erupted in roaring applause. The story was reported in the Time magazine a few days later. Students ignored 8 pickets outside and sat down together in an assembly hall to cheer a black student leader who urged them to make their own town a lighthouse in Marion County. When white students expressed views that at the time were considered moderate, if not downright liberal, they often made the national news as a juxtaposition to the ways in which Southern politicians, parents, and business leaders were responding to court enforced desegregation. A week before Alexander v. Holmes' court ruling, the students at Murrah High in Jackson wrote an article entitled Time for Tolerance. The tone of the article was not one of ardent desegregationists, but it was clear that the white student writers were determined to give this new experiment of desegregation a try. The student editorial was reproduced in the Washington Post. We will not attempt to argue the merits or demerits of forced desegregation. The change is inevitable. Integration is not a communist plot, it is merely another of many means to eliminate racial discrimination. We do, however, deplore the attempts of some misguided citizens to circumvent direct Supreme Court orders. The only rational alternative is to comply with the law and help maintain the best possible education system. All of us, student, teachers, parents, and administrators, must cooperate to achieve quality education. Willie Morris recounted a meeting that he had with Allie DeSalle, daughter of the state Herman DeSalle, and a group of white students at Yazoo City High. The schools were in the midst of desegregating, and these comments were testimony to Morris that change was coming to Mississippi. Alice told him, 5 years ago, the people here were against integration. The rednecks were in power in both in the school and town. Now it's a little unfashionable to say you're against it. There's a generational gap here, just like everywhere else. People say it's the adult leaders who are making this work here. I don't think the older generation here realizes how much the white people need the color people. In the fall of 1972, Ricky Nations began Jim Hill High School, a formerly all-black school in Jackson. A white student, Ricky was curious about the name of his new school and researched its origins. He discovered that Jim Hill was the first black Secretary of State in Mississippi, elected during Reconstruction. Ricky's English teacher was June Meredith, wife of James Meredith. Ricky recalled trying to persuade Mrs. Meredith to talk about the 1962 riots at the University of Mississippi. Her response was always, "We're here to talk about English, we're not here to talk about riots, and we're not here to talk about marches." FOC had been in place in Jackson for several years, so Ricky had attended schools with a few black students prior to total desegregation. When he decided to run for student body president in Jim Hill High School, he wanted solidarity to be the central platform of his campaign. Ricky described how he enlisted the help of a black classmate, Marvis Dennis, whom he met when he was in 7th grade, to stage a dramatic campaign speech. The speech was about a page and a half. It talked about how we had gone to school together and this was our first year that we had done well. And Wingfield was kind of our rival, and we had shown them we were as good or better than they were. I said, "We put white power with black power, and we've gotten tiger power." When I said that, the place exploded, and Marvis dropped a sign that said, "Vote United, Vote Nations," and United Nations was real big. Certainly, white and black students often bungled terribly when they tried to interact with each other. After all, most of them had little experience in developing relationships with members of the opposite race, and the adults in their lives were rarely good role models on how to traverse the difficult terrain of race relations. Frank conversations among adults and students or black and white students about power, privilege, accommodation, and assimilation were not part of the routine preparations for desegregation. White students, even the most liberal ones, were often clueless about the sense of loss many students felt in having to come to a white school and conform to their way of doing things. As such, dissent and dissatisfaction between black and white students frequently arose. Unfortunately, the adults were not much better attuned to the nuances of loss and accommodation. Such was the case of the first pep rally at newly desegregated Pass Christian High School in 1969. Pep rallies have been a long contested student space, for they represent for many students a site to glorify the students at the top of the hierarchical clique ladder, the students that most conform to the adult ideals and expectations. Many students who do not see themselves as part of those groups openly demonstrate their contempt for the in crowd by refusing to participate in the cheers, chants, school songs, and skits. During school desegregation, pep rallies could particularly tense times as the entire student body gathered in close quarters, far from the direct supervision of teachers and staff. At the first pep rally of the year, the direct supervision of at the first pep rally of the year at Pass Christian High, many of the black students refused to participate in the cheerleaders' mandate to get on their feet and show their school spirit. The white head cheerleader was distressed by her black peers' refusal to participate in her well-planned pep rally, so in her best cheerleading voice, she grabbed the microphone and yelled, "I want you Randolph kids to get up and yell." Lamar Beatty, the principal, disagreed with her singling out the black students, so he quietly made his way to the podium and pulled the cheerleader to the side. "Look," he told her, I don't want to be critical, and I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I need to say something." He then took the microphone and addressed the student body. "I want to make one thing very plain. There are no Randolph kids in this building. We're all past Christian High School. I know some of y'all are in a different school, but from this day forward, there's no such thing as Randolph and Pass Christian High School. This is Pass Christian High, and that's it." Beatty's intent was to emphasize solidarity and unity. While good intentioned, the problem was that in reality, the white students were Pass Christian High. They did not have to give up anything to assume that identity. The black students from Randolph did not feel any affinity for Pass Christian High, with its pep rally rituals and a culture already established and largely defined by the head cheerleader imploring them to get up and yell. This expectation of accommodation and assimilation was at the heart of why interracial relationships beyond the surface were hard to establish and sustain during early school desegregation, despite the best intentions of both black and white students who personally wanted to reach across racial divides. As school districts devised plans to desegregate their schools, they often paid little regard to the rich history and traditions of black schools. They closed black high schools and converted them to junior high or elementary schools, and their names, often in honor of a black educator or other prominent local leaders, were changed. Little care was taken to preserve the artifacts of the school's curricular and extracurricular history. Quite literally, in many places, the black schools' trophies and plaques were tossed in the trash as school systems rushed to tear down, renovate, and refurbish school facilities in preparation for massive relocations of students. This was one of the most incredible losses of school desegregation. Typical of many school districts, the Greenville City school system converted the black high school Coleman High to a junior high. Not only did it demote a football coach who had an impressive 14-year winning history at the school, but in that conversion, their trophies, plaques, composite class pictures, and citations were destroyed. All symbols of blackness were removed, recounts Sarah Johnson, a member of the city council in Greenville and a member of the Mississippi Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Certainly, many schools during the desegregation process tried to create new traditions. They allowed the students to choose new school colors, new school mottos, or perhaps new mascot, but what constitutes a culture, even high school culture, is not simply in the visible objects. Cultures manifested in the subtleties of how do we do things around here. When black students were relocated to the newly desegregated schools, they were expected to adapt, adopt, and assimilate to the already established white ways of doing things. Robert Gibbs, who was transferred to Brinkley High to Murrah High, as part of Jackson's desegregation efforts, commented that it was not the academic challenges that most distressed black students in their new school, rather, it was the changes in culture. For Robert, this cultural difference was most obvious in the high school band. Black and white high school and college bands have been known for their distinctive differences in their styles of marching, music, drum majors, and color guard majorettes. When Robert and his black classmates joined the Murrah High band, they were expected to adapt to the more traditional precision style of marching and playing at Murrah High School, which they reluctantly did. However, Robert noted that the rules had been reversed. Whites had not only would not have so easily adapted to the band culture of Brinkley High. When you think about integrating schools and the decision made to send blacks to integrate into a white culture, how we were probably able to do that easier than doing it the other way if you had to make whites try to integrate into our culture. I just don't see them being able to dance a halftime show or play the songs that we played. I think it would have been very, very difficult. We learned how to be a more disciplined, regimented band. I don't think they could have done it the other way. According to Robert, the two different band cultures finally clashed, leading to a confrontation between the former Brinkley High band members and their white band director, Mr. Dollarhide. Mr. Dollarhide was deep in tradition, and he was used to marching at very traditional styles, and we were used to more upbeat style, and tried to become disciplined enough to do that was a challenge, and he would have to constantly get on us about our lack of discipline. There was one thing that kind of brought it to a head. Mr. Dollarhide had designed this halftime show with a ship, and the song that was going to play was the good ship Lollipop. And we kind of rebelled on that. We just decided we can't do that. We just can't do it. Robert and his fellow band members conceded to play the song one time. In return, Robert noted Mr. Dollarhide agreed to add a few more upbeat songs to the band's repertoire. Cheerleading styles were also very different in black and white schools prior to desegregation, as Harold Bishop discovered when he and his father, who was principal of Eastman High, visited the all-white Corinth High to watch one of its football games. While the playing on the field was remarkably similar to Harold's experiences as a football player, the cheerleaders, according to Bishop, were vastly different. The cheerleaders at Corinth High were sequential and militarized in the manner they cheered. They cheered by the numbers. When one arm went up, everybody's arm went up. Go, 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 team, go. And everybody's head dropped at the same time. It was practiced and rehearsed carefully. They were motivated, but they were militaristic. In contrast, the Eastham High cheerleaders were far less rehearsed and much more impromptu, Bishop continues. Girl might yell of all of a sudden, I've got it, and everyone else in tuning in would say gotta what, and she'd yell a little louder, I got it, and the other girls would go gotta what. And then they'd join the stand, she'd grab her ankles, it's in my ankles, and they would say, where is it, gotta what, it's in my knee, and she'd go all the way up to her brain, and finally she'd come down and say the Eastham Spirit, and everybody would give a yell, and everybody would have the Eastham Spirit. Robert Gibbs was similarly surprised. The cheers from the cheerleaders at Murrah High were just totally different from the cheers we were used to at Brinkley High. We had a much more lively, more upbeat way of doing things, and we had to learn to be a lot more subtle and uptight. Thomas Evans and his black friends referred to the style of cheering at newly desegregated Madison Ridgeland High as bland and a far cry from the cheers of a segregated Rosa Scott. Cheers like, hey, hey, Thomas Evans, hey, hey, Thomas Evans, I got my eyes on you, I got my eyes on you, I got my eyes on you, and everything that you do. I got my eyes on your shooby dooby doo. As discussed earlier, some schools adopted policies of equal representation of black and white students in extracurricular activities. However, cheerleading squads were often not included in such policies. While some schools use teacher recommendations, grades, or popular vote to determine the cheerleading squads during school desegregation, many schools increasingly turned to judges to select the squads. Sometimes the judges were teachers, but often people outside the school setting were used to select the cheerleaders. This resulted in many squads being comprised primarily of white girls, even if white students were a numerical minority and the athletes for whom they cheered for were primarily black. Such was the case at Starkville High, where, according to Fenton Peters, black football players easily integrated into the existing football culture, but black girls struggled in making the cheerleading squad. The cheerleading thing did not go very well because that is a very sought after position that parents seek for their children. Black cheerleaders were not able to break into that society very well. If they had 8 cheerleaders, probably no more than 2 were black. The criteria was fixed in such a way that only a few blacks would qualify. His reference to criteria is important because it refers to a particular look and type of cheerleading valued in the high schools to which black students were typically transferred. Black girls vying for one of the few coveted positions on their high school squads were expected to adopt the more white style of cheerleading. This included tumbling moves, pyramid building, tight arm formations, and highly synchronized cheers and chants. It was the mechanistic style of cheerleading that Harold Bishop saw at Corinth High and the National Cheerleading Association taught to white girls throughout the country at their summer camps. For black girls to have any chance of being selected as cheerleaders for the newly desegregated schools, they had to adapt to this new style of cheerleading, which was clearly different from the improvisational style of cheerleading in segregated black schools. When black girls failed to make the squads and filed complaints about the overrepresentation of white girls, school officials pointed out the objective criteria being used in the selection process. They argued that black girls simply did not have the requisite technical/athletic capabilities. But there was another reason why black girls did not fare so well in the cheerleading selection process. It had to do with the symbolic meaning of the cheerleader. In American culture and high school life, Grundy notes that cheerleaders were expected not simply to master routines, but to project a look, a combination of clothing, hairstyle, figure, and enthusiastic charm considered to embody the ideals of youthful womanhood. With the feminization of cheerleading in the 40s and 50s, cheerleaders came to represent a particular type of girl, the kind Olivia Newton-John portrayed in the movie Grease. The kind of girl that other girls envied and the boys wanted to date. It was a high status position with significant social capital, sometimes extending beyond the campus, as described by Tina Freeman Horn. Being one of the 8 Marat cheerleaders in a school of over 8,000 people was probably the biggest thing that could happen to a North Jackson girl. Being a white cheerleader in the 1970s meant entering the closed inner circle of Northeast Jackson women in society. Perhaps there was an invitation to the Subdebs and the Subdeb Ball, which was the high school version of the pre-debutante. Being a high school cheerleader was the social equivalent of being the quarterback. Just as quarterback represented the most desirable form of masculinity, the cheerleader signified the wholesome, cute, all-American girl. And that symbol was most certainly reserved for white girls, as evident in the sharp contrast between the composition of football teams and cheerleading squads in newly integrated schools. Whites were far more receptive to black athletes on their football and basketball teams, where their masculinity was valued in the highly competitive world of sports, than they were to black cheerleaders representing their schools at the prettiest, most popular girls on campus. Cheerleading survived school desegregation, and black cheers and chants sometimes found their way into a squad's repertoire, although the girls yelling them remained primarily white. Likewise, sports, student, government, homecoming, band, choir, class favorites, and other local school rituals and traditions returned to desegregated schools with as much vigor as before. However, one extracurricular activity did not weather desegregation so well, and in some places it vanished never to return: the school prom. School prom is ubiquitous in American youth and high school culture. It is hard to think of a movie about American high school that does not feature the prom or a school dance somewhere in its plot, character development, setting, or theme. Amy Best, author of Prom Night, traces its roots to the debutante balls, where young women of wealthy families were presented into society to signal their availability for courtship and marriage. Borrowing from the glamour and elegance of the debutante ball, or the cotillion ball, proms in high schools represented a democratized version of the debutante ball that afforded anyone attending high school the opportunity to feel as if they were too coming out, that they could transcend boundaries of class. The message was that you did not have to be rich to wear a fancy frock, to be adorned with a corsage, or to waltz the night away. By the 50s, the prom had become institutionalized in most American high schools. It was the culminating grand gala to which many students looked forward to all year. For high school students from Tampa to Des Moines to Portland to Biloxi, the prom signaled a rite of passage marking the end of high school and end to high school and adolescence and the beginning of adulthood. The prom was imbued with rituals and traditions. Teens were expected to don evening gowns and tuxedos and to look and act like an adult in ways never allowed anywhere else on their high school campus. It was a time of fun, frivolity, and freedom. The prom was also highly charged with sexuality and romance. Students talked about it in terms of a first date, a first kiss, or a first sexual encounter. The intimate dinner before the prom, the music, the dim lights, the adult clothing, the dancing, and the intimate touching of bodies made the prom different from all other extracurricular activities. This was the reason why almost all schools in the South immediately eliminated school sponsored proms and other school dances after desegregation. Principals, superintendents, and school boards sometimes rationalized their decision to eliminate the prom as schools ought not to be in the dance business. Although historically schools had been in the dance business for years, school officials did not publicly cite fears of amalgamation, non-mongrelization, and miscegenation as the reason why the prom was eliminated. However, concerns about improper and inappropriate race mixing undergirded the decision to eliminate the prom, codifying a racial trope extensively used by the Citizens Council in the 1950s and early 1960s to garner support for their anti-integration stance. School integration would compromise the innocence and purity of their white daughters. In the aftermath of the Brown decision, Judge Tom Brady, whose book Black Monday became the unofficial handbook of the Citizens Council, constantly stirred up fears about black men as sexual predators when he addressed white audiences about the dangers of school integration. Here's an excerpt from a speech he delivered in 1957 to the Commonwealth Club of California in San Francisco. Make no mistake about this, the Southern fathers and mothers are not going to permit their daughters to be humiliated or insulted by Negroes or by anyone else. They are not going to permit their daughters to have to have to resist the lewd advances of Negro boys. Socializing their children into a fear of black male sexuality was imperative to maintaining white supremacy, and the Citizens Council carried this message to white children into a regular feature in The Citizen, its official newspaper, called A Manual for a Southerner. Here, 5th and 6th graders were warned of the dire consequences of race mixing brought about by school desegregation. Who wants to dance with a boy or girl of another race? Could you enjoy a party where black and white children are mixed? The race mixers even want Negroes and whites to date each other. They know that if boys and girls share the schoolroom, the lunchroom, dances, sports, restrooms, and playgrounds, that the boys and girls will want to date each other. For older students, the Citizens Council sponsored essay contests with the winners receiving $500. In 1960, the high school students responded with the following prompt: Why I believe in the social separation of races of mankind. In one of the winning essays, Mary Rosalind Healy wrote, I know that the social exposure of one race to another brings about a laxity of principles and a complacency toward differences which can only develop into an incurable epidemic of intermarriage. This malady has but one inevitable result: racial death. This is, I must believe, in the social separation of the races of mankind, because I am a Christian and must abide by the laws of God. Fears about black boys and men as sexual predators of white girls became the basis for a law the Mississippi legislature passed in '64, allowing school districts to submit desegregation plans on segregating schools and classrooms by sex. The school districts of Amity County, Carroll County, Coffeyville, and Senatobia submitted such plans to HEW. The Carroll County superintendent told a federal judge that the primary reason why they wanted sex segregated schools in his school district was to keep the black teenage boys away from the white girls. The Natchez Adams County School Board tried unsuccessfully to pass such a policy. Jack Davis described the rhetoric used to gain support for their proposal. Segregationist organizations blanketed the state with an inflammatory literature, some with alarming images and all carrying the imprimatur of Thomas Dixon's Ghost, warning against the dire consequences of school integration, racial mongrelization, no loving white parent. Literature, either implied or expressed, would want to open the front door to a black boy, a schoolmate, calling on his/her daughter. However, while battles were being waged about sex segregated schools, representation on cheerleading squads, and other issues of access and equality, black and white parents in most Mississippi communities quietly reached an unspoken agreement about the prom. It would be replaced with separate, segregated dances held off campus and privately sponsored. Almost overnight, and with little protest, the prom disappeared as a school sponsored extracurricular activity. Why did the elimination of the prom precipitate little protest for teachers and principals tasked with chaperoning dances? The decision seems apparent. It was much easier to eliminate the prom than to try to police student behavior based on unwritten but clearly understood rules about the appropriate physical interaction between black and white male and female students. For students, particularly white students, the prom in most places continued in much the same fashion as it had before, other than it was held off campus and funded by parents. But why was there not an outpouring of protest from black parents and students who understood all too well the racist narrative undergirding the decision to eliminate the prom? After all, black parents filed lawsuits about other extracurricular activities and boycotted schools that attempted to institute sex segregated classrooms during school desegregation. Unlike other extracurricular activities, the prom goals was solely and explicitly social. It was an extension of the private sphere designed to promote a form of intimacy and social integration that few black parents desired for their children. As Lily V. Davis, a longtime black educator in Marks, remarked, I wasn't interested in socializing with whites going into their homes and whatnot. The fight black parents waged on behalf of their children to attend desegregated schools was about equal access to funding, resources, facilities, and educational opportunities so that black children could realize their potential and their dreams about artificial constraints placed on them because of the color of their skin. As Jack Davis notes, blacks were no more or no less interested in socially or physically intermingling with the other race than were whites, and blacks had no designs on private white institutions such as family and church. But the elimination of the school sponsored prom after desegregation without much black protest also points to the absence of an all too recent past. Haunted by the ghosts of Emmett Till and Mac Parker, black parents had much more to fear than white parents about the repercussions of even the hint of a sexual impropriety across racial lines. They knew all too well the ramifications for the sons of a white girl's accusation of an inappropriate touch or sexual innuendo while dancing. They also knew very well that their daughters had little recourse if a white boy took sexual liberties in a dark high school parking lot in a state with a long history of looking the other way when white men sexually violated black women. For black parents and community activists, the prom was simply not worth fighting for. In 1997, actor Morgan Freeman approached the school board in his hometown of Charleston, Mississippi, with an offer to pay for the first school-sponsored prom at Charleston High, and since desegregation, the school board declined this offer. In 2008, he made the offer again, and they accepted this time, and Freeman challenged the students to plan an integrated prom. On April 19, 2008, Charleston High held its first interracial prom. However, the tradition of having a separate whites-only prom continued. Concerns about interracial dating, dancing, marriage, and sexual contact were the primary reasons given for the continuance of the whites-only prom. Comments such as, "I'm not going to have mixed babies in our family," and "ain't no going to rub up on my daughter," were publicly expressed at the first planning meeting for whites-only prom. Some of the white students at Charleston High refused to attend the segregated prom. Others attended both the white prom and the school prom, and a few white students snubbed the school prom. Clearly disappointed that the whites only prom continued, Freeman blamed the white parents for perpetuating in their children a fear of social interaction across racial lines. He described the persistence of such racism as the shackles around our soul. In the extracurricular activities of schooling, the impenetrability of pervasive racial tropes would be tested with students themselves often being at the forefront of such challenges. John Griffin Jones, the author of the opening quote of this chapter, finishes his explanation of the bridging role of extracurricular activities, particularly sports, during school desegregation with the following: "The key was getting to know something about each other as individuals. And in that critical context, sports performed its historical function as the great leveler, talent on the field providing the common ground. From there, we would commit to something we held in common, and with enough time and constant contact, become friends." Jones personifies the hopes of these who believed in the transformative possibilities of school desegregation to dismantle racism. The students learned together in the same classroom, competed together on the football field and basketball court, and played the trombone side by side. Racial stereotypes would be challenged, and progress in race relations should be made. Students like John Griffin Jones would be the generation at the vanguard of change. Indeed, it was often the student level that desegregation worked best, as students reached across racial lines to form relationships based on individual commonalities and shared adolescent interests and concerns, often in the context of extracurricular activities. However, Jones also notes the limitations of a liberal discourse of a social change based on individual attitudinal changes. The sad but honest truth about the early period of desegregation is that outside these mandates, the required black and white students to work together, and of course outside the galvanizing force of Maras sports, that there was little interest in mixing, to use a hateful term trumpeted by the likes of Mississippi Governor slash Senator Theodore G. Bilbo. It was often in the extracurricular that the racial divide was the most visible, serving as a powerful reminder that deeply entrenched beliefs about racial relations in the South would not suddenly or simply disappear with a court order, a desegregation plan, and the merging of two student bodies. White and black football players would comfortably banter as they showered together after a victorious game. Black and white homecoming maids would sit on the sidelines wearing similar crowns and cheer for the same team. White Beta Club members would rally around their black candidate running for a state office. However, such togetherness seldom translated into socializing outside of school. As Jones' confession about above illuminates, outside a few school-sanctioned extracurricular spaces, black and white students retreated to a fairly segregated social lives. They did not spend the night at each other's homes, attend each other's birthday parties, or hang out in each other's bedrooms on a Saturday night. These were intimate spaces deemed unsuitable for racial mixing. The social separation outside of school was not the result of any formal school policy, but school social integration outside a narrowly drawn line was regulated, constrained, and sometimes prohibited through school policies and practices meant to maintain the social separation between the races. The Citizens Council may have lost its battle to preserve state-run segregated schools, but the ideological underpinnings of its resistance persisted long after schools were finally desegregated. And that marks the end of Chapter 7 of Just Trying to Have School.